It's fitting in this time that we start talking about savings, investment in the financial system. We've alluded to them to some extent already in our solo model. We've played with some of these things, looking at whether or not people are saving in the current environment or not. Now what we need to do is zoom in on how and if savings gets turned into investment. It's not a foregone conclusion that it does. So what determines our investment rate? Now I'll make a note, obviously I'm not using the same notation I was earlier. What determines, this would be analogous to what determines the savings rate, but really we're talking about what determines what portion of savings makes it into investment. Now this shouldn't be too hard for you. Hopefully by now you all have a built-in response, and the answer is institutions, the rules. Rules determine the incentives that people have to invest in and use effectively the factors of production, and those institutions and incentives also determine whether people have an incentive, A, to save, and B, if they save, to lend their savings to somebody else who may or may not repay it. So, again, we have savings, which is deferred consumption. This is the portion of output that's not consumed. And implicitly up until now, until we started talking in some of our chats and then some of the videos I did, we were assuming that all savings made it into investment. But that isn't the same thing. So we need to talk here about the difference between saving and investment. Investment is not deferred consumption. Rather, it is the purchase of new capital. It could also be the purchase or acquisition or investment in new human capital. It doesn't have to be just physical capital. This is new capital, physical or human capital. And so these are fundamentally different things. Savings and investment they're neither the same thing, nor are they usually done by the same people. So something else must be going on here. So let's see if we can run through this. Now, if we were in class, we could have a meaningful discussion about this. I could force you to do a thumbs up, thumbs down, but maybe stop and jot this down. I'll put in some pauses here. Now, many of you may not know what a falafel is. Falafel is balls of chickpeas with spices that are deep fried. They're quite tasty if they're done well. Pita Pit has a pretty good falafel sandwich, so next time you stop into Pita Pit, maybe give falafel a try. But falafel was all over when I was in Iraq. It's all over the Middle East. It's all over many parts. It's over in Greece, etc. So it turns out maybe you have a falafel stand where you make falafel sandwiches on the street. So here would be the question. Is buying a new pan for your falafel stand investment? The answer is yes. Maybe I didn't give you enough time there. Hopefully I did. The answer is yes. If it's a new pan, that's investment. Now, here's where people oftentimes get a little bit confused. Is when I maybe buy into something, or maybe let's hold that thought for a moment and go on to the next one here. So yes, buying a new pan for your falafel stand is investment. It qualifies as investment both on a personal level and on the economic level. Because what we're trying to understand is the acquisition of new capital at the economy-wide level, not at the individual level. How about buying someone else's falafel stand? Is that investment? And the answer there is nope, it is not. On a personal level, we may call that investment. I'm going to invest in a falafel stand. But that falafel stand already existed. It was already in operation in the economy. And even if it wasn't in operation, it was already there as physical capital. And so that is just the transfer of existing capital. So if you think in our solo model, that wouldn't change the amount of capital in the economy, which is what our investment line is. It's the acquisition of new capital. So buying someone else's falafel stand is not investment, even though on a personal level, we oftentimes do call it investment. And this is what I was starting to say, is that people oftentimes where they get confused and where they get frustrated is they say, no, look, on a personal level, I am buying into this. I am investing in this. But for us as economists, that doesn't change the fact. The fact that you're buying into it on a personal level, that isn't investment for us as economists. And this is an important distinction. If you keep this clear, because remember, what we're trying to understand is the overall acquisition of new capital and extent to which old capital breaks down in the economy. We're trying to understand the economy as a whole at this point in the semester. How about buying a share in a falafel stand? Somebody comes to you and says, here, I've got this great investment opportunity. I'm starting a falafel stand, and I'd like to sell you a share in that stand. Now, we're going to talk later about shares. Shares are a stock of ownership. Is that investment? Now, as I phrased it, so there's two options. One being, I'm starting a falafel stand. I'd like you to invest. And the other is, I've got this enterprise that's going great guns. Would you like to buy into my business? So the first one, what do you think? Versus the second one. Now we have two options. So the first one again is, I'm starting a new venture. The second one is, I've got a bang-up business going here. Would you like to buy in? So I'll give you a few seconds to maybe jot down and commit yourself. Again, a useful exercise to commit yourself, and then I'll talk about this. In case you're not aware, I'm trying to actually wait long enough to make it a little bit more painful to you if you aren't actually committing yourself to something. Because I know the tendency is going to be to sit there at home and just listen to these while maybe playing Animal Crossing or something else. So the answer here is, well, no. This would be a response to what? This would be a response to the second formulation. Most shares, if you buy a share, and that's the reason I put no in here. If you think about if you go out and buy shares in Apple, is that going to be new capital in the economy? No. What you are doing is buying somebody else's share. Somebody else already owned it. This capital was, and regardless of the fact of whether somebody else owned it or not, this capital was already being used in the economy. On the other hand, if it was a new venture, then yeah, that would be investment. So hopefully we get some sense of this. Now, how does savings get turned into investment? As I mentioned, oftentimes the people who are saving and who are borrowing are different people. So the book has this picture, and I think it's a reasonable thing to think about here, is we have this bridge of financial intermediation. We have the savers on one side, who are deferring their consumption, who are setting aside resources. And then on the right-hand side, we have the people who would like to borrow money in order to engage in investment. So savers can be households, firms, and venture capitalists. Borrowers can be firms, entrepreneurs, and households, not meant to be a definitive list. And then in the middle, you have banks, bond markets, stock markets, and some other stuff. Now, I have had in the last, 10 years, I've had natural events or world events conspire to make my life as an instructor easier. Because the case can be made here that we can't take this bridge for granted. Resources do not necessarily seamlessly cross this bridge, going from savers to borrowers. That doesn't always happen. It's possible to break this bridge. And the reason I say, that it's possible to break this bridge, most of you may remember, or at least be old enough to vaguely remember, the events of 2008, 2009, and particularly those that followed in the years after 2008, 2009, and the financial crisis. Basically, what happened is that this system, this bridge, broke. Now, if you look, the book lists out some possible things that would cause this bridge to break. You can have insecure property rights, politicized lending, government banks, interest rate controls, inflation, bank failures, and panics. Except for the last one there, hopefully, maybe you should say, okay, why are those first 5 familiar to you? And if so, what do they scream to you? What jumps out at you? Hopefully you're sitting at home jotting down on a sheet of paper institutions. Hopefully those seem familiar. So in other words, it's possible to break this bridge. And the main way we break this bridge is by messing with the institutions. Now, it is also possible that for things that were not institutional, as is currently the argument, is because of the current epidemic, many businesses and maybe financial institutions are at risk of going under, not through any real fault of their own, but simply because of natural disasters and events, and that would be maybe we're going to have some bank failures and panics. I don't think that's going to happen, but that also can break the bridge. But big picture, as ever, you should probably be thinking in terms of institutions. Institutions, institutions, institutions. So let's zoom in and let's talk about what financial intermediaries we have here. Well, right, we're going to come back and circle back around. The book, of course, lists banks, bond markets, and stock markets. There are other financial intermediaries, but those are going to be the main ones we focus on. Families oftentimes engage in financial intermediation, smoothing consumption. I know my parents helped me out. I was fortunate enough to have parents that had saved and were committed to my education, and so who helped fund part of my higher education. In effect, they were serving as financial intermediaries. It's also, or maybe you could view it as we directly connected without the need for financial intermediaries. They had cut back on their consumption in the past so that I could, right now, how am I paying them back? It's a little bit different, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that financial intermediaries, it isn't the case that banks, bond markets, and stock markets are the only financial intermediaries. They happen to be probably the most important and visible ones in this economy. But if you travel to other areas and you do business in other areas or you read about other areas, banks, bond markets, and stock markets may not be the primary form of financial intermediation. So we've got, in effect, we have the savings pool. So let's step back and say, what determines savings? Now, we all know by now, hopefully, your instinct is, say it with me, institutions. That's what determines whether people have incentives to defer their consumption or not. Maybe. But the book's going to list out a few other things, and I'm going to roll with it here. In the specific, again, zooming in on that narrow case, we can model the 3 determinants of savings to be consumption smoothing, impatience or time preference, and marketing or psychology. Now, I'm going to make the case that the first one there is the one that does the heavy lifting. Now, interest rate, does that determine savings? I'm going to make the argument that no, interest rates do not. An interest rate is what you're paid to save. And so, in effect, maybe we are back in the realm of supply and demand. And so supply is savings. We have savers who are supplying their loanable funds to the market. And we have the borrowers who are demanding loanable funds from the market. So let's see here if we can figure out this consumption smoothing bit. Now, I will probably end up putting up a video working through how to use this. The idea here right now is, because this is going to be the piece that does the heavy lifting. Now, oftentimes people try and develop an intuition here. I have discovered over the years that I and students tend to struggle developing an intuition about what's going to happen with consumption smoothing. It turns out, however, to be relatively straightforward to do some simple calculations to figure out what's going to happen. Right now, let's focus on the concept. And the concept is, the red line here is what you would make if you, or what your consumption would be if you consumed the entirety of your income every year. So during your working years, you would be consuming a lot. You'd be having a really nice standard of living. Of course, as soon as you retire, you would have to rely upon the kindness of strangers and upon Social Security, which, spoiler alert, I don't expect that Social Security will be functioning when I retire, and I definitely don't think it will be functioning when you retire. So we would probably have a very low income if we consumed everything in our working years and consumed everything in our retirement. In other words, we would have a high level of consumption during our working years and then a very low level of consumption. Now again, consumption here being a measure of standard of living. And so the sensible thing, I think most of us understand that living really, really well until you hit 65 or 70 and then having to eke out an existence begging or eating secondhand food that's not a great thing to do. What most of us would sensibly want to do is basically, if we could and we had perfect information, would be to perfectly smooth out our consumption. So in other words, during our working years, we defer consumption. We take some of what we earn and some of what we make and we set it aside. And then when we retire, it turns out that we can actually now consume more than what we are making. And if we do it right, this picture shows a little bit of a blip here, a downturn, but again, and that oftentimes happens to some extent, but if we could do this perfect, I would say that is a bug, not a feature. In a perfect world, and again, we'd have to allow for the time value of consumption. That's another thing that we're going to talk about before too long, is how to use the present value formula. It's important, particularly when we get to bond yields, but we'll set that to one side here. So obviously, we've made some simplifying assumptions for this picture here. We've assumed that you're going to be making the same amount in every year that you are making money, and we're assuming you are going to retire on the same amount every year. As you're going to see when I actually work through some of this and on the board here, and I'll see if I probably won't do that today, but I will definitely try and get it up before Monday. I tend to make more simplifying assumptions and assume away all earnings in retirement, and it just makes things work out more easily, and I assume that you're shooting for or trying to get perfectly smooth consumption. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Hopefully it makes sense that you probably don't want to consume everything during your working years. That most people, it would be a sensible thing. Now, there's always issues with self-control and discipline, and can you do it, and do you do it correctly, and a whole bunch of other things like that. But conceptually, this is one reason why people save, is to smooth their consumption. And I would argue it's the main piece. Now, again, in a live chalk and talk or marker board example, I'll sort of give you a sense of how to work with this, hopefully. It turns out that this can encapsulate a whole bunch of things. We can start talking about what happens when you change the tax rate, what happens when you change life expectancy, what happens when you change the year at which people start working, what happens when you change when they retire, what happens when you change the amount that they receive in retirement. It turns out this is, yet again, another tool, another framework to take a bunch of confusing, rapidly inundating information and channel it into a model and a tool for making sense of where it belongs and then engaging in meaningful storytelling. Okay, so let's come to the second reason why people save. And basically, it's not really why people save, but it's going to be a determinant of how much people save. And that's impatience or time preference. So let's see if we can wrap our head around what we mean by time preference or discount rates. That's another way of saying this. So would you prefer a new car tomorrow or a new car in a year? Assume that they're the same quality car. They're both new cars, but they're the same car with the same features. So we don't have to try and adjust for the fact that features do change over time and cars tend to improve. because then that's going to mix up and confuse things. So would you prefer a new car tomorrow or in a year? I'm guessing all of us would prefer a new car tomorrow rather than a new car that's the same quality of car a year from now. But maybe that's a little silly. Maybe the question would be, do you prefer one piece of baklava today or two pieces in a year? Some of you, again, may know baklava is a pastry. It's a sweet. I was mainly exposed to it in Greek cuisine before I went to Iraq and the Middle East. Turns out Greek baklava is one particular type. There's an almost infinite number of types, but basically you can treat it as pastry, sweets, or candy here. Would you prefer one piece of baklava today or two pieces in a year? Now they're going to both be equally fresh, right? Would you prefer one piece of baklava that's baked this morning, today, or would you prefer a piece of baklava that is baked the morning of the day that is 2 years from today, or 1 year from today? Would you prefer a piece today or two pieces in a year? Most people, the answer is going to be, I'll take the piece today. That is not a sufficiently high number a year from now. Maybe we could put this in pure monetary terms. Would you prefer $1,000 tomorrow or $1,000 in a year? And I hope most of us would say, I'll take the $1,000 today. Now, some people will say, I'll take the $1,000 today because, heck, I could invest it. But maybe if you go out and you look at stock and bond markets, you can invest it, but you're not going to get very much for it. Right? The market interest rate is pretty darn low. But let's say that, right? So let's assume away. Let's ignore the, well, and again, would that be investment? Not necessarily. I would basically say you could take that $1,000 and send it across the bridge to somebody who wants to borrow it. But maybe, so I think most of the reason for what I'm trying to illustrate with these is we as creatures are impatient. We discount pain in the future and we discount pleasure in the future. This is part of why it is hard to save money. This is part of why it's hard to lose weight. It's part of why it's hard to study for classes is we're impatient. And so we emphasize pain in the present at the expense of value in the future, or alternately, we overemphasize the value of pleasure in the present and discount the cost or the pain in the future. Now, it turns out we could figure out and zoom in on what your discount rate is. In other words, what's the rate at which you discount the future? And the way in which we could do that would be we could continue to increase the money that we're offering you a year from now. So we say, okay, would you take $1,000 today or $1,001 a year from now? And I think most of us would say, heck, I'll still take the $1,000 today. And we could increase it. And we could say, okay, how about 1,002? Nah, I'll take the 1,000. 1,003, I'll take the 1,000. We could keep going. Once we hit the point where you say, no, wait. At $1,100, I think I'll go ahead and take the $1,100 a year from now rather than the $1,000 today. Turns out from that we could actually zoom in and get more specific as to the rate at which you discount the future, or get some sense of your time preference or impatience. The key at this point is just that we are impatient creatures, and so how impatient we are is going to determine savings. So now this is not going to be on an individual level. This would need to be the case on a societal level. So if you compared two societies, one where people are more patient and one where people are less patient, the society where people are less patient would have a lower savings rate because people are going to say, screw it, I'm going to consume more in the present. And this again is in addition to consumption smoothing here. At the extreme, you could have a group of people who are, a society of people who are so impatient that they look at that consumption smoothing picture and they say, screw it, you know what? That reduction in my standard of living when I'm 65 or 70, that's so far off. I know that it's going to suck when I get there, but I'm going to discount that suckage sufficiently that it is not outweighing the benefit I get of consuming in the present. By the way, again, I hope in all of this you're making notes as you go through these videos, jotting down areas where I have either not been particularly clear, or I thought I was clear but it didn't come through, or where you still have questions. That's really the purpose of our regular class get-togethers. So the more you write down things that you're puzzled by or unclear, the more effective I can be at filling those gaps. The key at this point is we as human beings are impatient creatures, and the more impatient that we are, the lower the savings rate in that society. The less impatient that we are, the higher the rate of savings in that society. So I'm going to stop here for a moment. That's not the end of the videos for today, but I'm going to leave you with this question, and I'm going to stop the video, and hopefully you'll jot down some thoughts in the interim before you load the next video about which types of people. Can you start to think about which types of people tend to have a higher discount rate or tend to discount the future more? We'll come back and talk about that.